So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, which is entitled "Can Cooperatives Save Farming?" I think they can, or they can go a long way to it. We've got a really interesting group of guests, and we've got a really interesting array of people in for the Q&A session as well. And what I'd like to get out of this evening would be to maybe figure out, okay, what are the steps we can take in terms of the cooperative movement to start moving things in a better direction to benefit farmers and consumers, both economically and socially. So, as I've already said, we're being recorded, and this event is being held by on Rabharta Glas. And I'll just introduce our panelists first. The way this evening is going to work is we'll have a talk from Patrick Doyle, who is the author of Civilising Rural Ireland, the Irish cooperative movement. And Patrick is going to talk about the history of the cooperative movement in Ireland, what it began from, and sort of what it has become and where it's at now. And we'll lead that into our discussion then to talk about the difficulties facing farmers and how we can move things in a better direction. After Patrick's talk, we'll bring in our three other panelists, who are Gerry Loftus from Mayo, who's the founder of the Rural Ireland organisation, and he's a long-term farming activist and also a beef and suckler farmer, I believe. Am I right there, Gerry?
Yeah, a little bit of that, sure.
Yeah. And we also have Evonne Boland, who's a member of the Open Food Network, which is a really interesting sort of consumer cooperative. Would that be the right way to describe it, Evonne? Which is really served to empower an awful lot of producers and link them up with their relevant consumers and make life a lot easier and better for all those parties. And we'll also be joined by Bridget Murphy, who's with Talamh and is also a long-term sheep farming up there in Sligo for a long time, and a long-time farming activist. So, yeah, Patrick, I'll hand it over to you. You can do your spiel, and then we'll begin the discussion. And then after the discussion, we will open the floor up to question and answer session for 20 minutes.
Wonderful, thanks, Colin. Hopefully my screen is sharing. Okay, very good. Yeah, so I think Bobby was asking at the start, I mean, how many of us had farming backgrounds? I should say I'm actually originally from Manchester, but both my parents would have been co-op families in rural Ireland, Sligo, actually, Bridget, and Kerry, which were, and to some extent still are, kind of quite strongholds of the dairy cooperative movement, particularly in the northwest area. But I'm actually also a member of Dublin Food Co-op, so I'm also thinking about this as an individual and citizen from the consumer side, and I'm also, for my sins, employed by the University of Limerick. And as Colin said, I've written a history of, should we say, the first 50 years of the Irish agricultural movement, which I'll talk a bit about tonight. And whilst I probably won't have any kind of like strong policy recommendations, I'll nevertheless try and think through maybe some of the implications and maybe some of the parallels with our present moment. So without further ado, I guess first thing I'll say is that just this is the overview of the talk, and maybe I might have to cut as I'm going through. Sometimes I have a tendency to kind of maybe be slightly overly verbose, so I'll try and keep it concise. But first of all, I'll just very quickly do a recap on what is a cooperative. I understand, that not everyone, people are sometimes coming to these topics fresh, so having a kind of a good working definition is probably a very useful start. Then I'll offer a kind of a historical perspective on Ireland's once world-leading agricultural cooperative sector. Then really ask what's happened since, so kind of thinking about what's happened after the book, really. If I have time, a quick note on cooperative credit and finance, because I think this actually might be a pointer towards what we can actually do politically and locally, and briefly ask them what's next. So, I mean, these scenes, I picked these two images from County Kerry, so near where my father's from, but these would have been scenes that have been very popular throughout rural Ireland, frankly. So the idea of the cooperative creamery at the heart of the local community, providing jobs, income for farming families, but also, and I think it's important to emphasize, these were also like social hubs that, a place where cultural activity happened. You had co-op creamery setting up some of the first cinemas in Ireland. So they were, lending libraries, they were dance halls, they were really kind of exciting, vibrant spaces. So they were for work and they were for jobs. They also did a whole lot more. They added a kind of a vibrancy to rural life, which is what some of the founders of the co-op movement were aiming at, and saw that as actually just as important to the economic benefits that people would be reaping. And thinking about what is a co-op, this is probably the best definition I found. It's from the sociologist Richard Sennett, who defined cooperation in his wonderful book Together as cooperation can be defined dryly as an exchange in which the participants benefit from the encounter. Basically, people cooperate to do what they can't do alone. And there are 7 cooperative principles that every cooperative organization should adhere to. And they actually are all kind of interlinked. So the idea that you only pick and choose a few, I think is actually, it wouldn't really work, I don't think. So they include voluntary and open membership. So no one should be forced to be a member of a co-op. Democratic member control, everyone has an equal say over the running of the organization. And therefore that leads into the fact that every member needs to be actively participating in the cooperative. They need to be autonomous and independent. So this could sometimes be framed as being non-political. They have to provide education, training, and information to members. So it's a constant stream of information and guidance, but also this kind of sense, I guess it's coming from the 19th century, the sense of also kind of moral and intellectual uplift. Also crucially, cooperatives should cooperate with one another. That's how you build the cooperative economy. And they should also have this 7th principle, which is a concern for the community. So they have to add social value to their surroundings. And the European Parliament stresses the fact that, cooperatives were crucial. This is talking about the last crisis, the one that we didn't quite finish, but we got into this one, which is that cooperatives, along with other social economy enterprises, play an essential role in the European economy, especially in time of crisis. And I think that's usually, it's very interesting when attention turns to cooperatives, because it's usually at quite a counter-cyclical moment where, frankly, things socially and economically aren't doing too well. So people turn to try and work out what some of the kind of the solutions are that can maybe take us out of our present malaise. And that's where co-ops tend to kind of start fermenting and becoming more proactive. Sometimes, cynically, maybe some might argue that cooperatives are created to be thrown under a bus. But actually, if you look at cooperatives in different parts of Europe around the world, actually they have a very kind of a better chance of becoming long-term social and economic businesses and have a much longer lifespans than maybe other types of private businesses that will be set up at the same time. So they do create profitability and solidarity, high quality jobs, strengthening social, economic and regional cohesion, and generate social capital. They're not a marginal phenomenon either as well. It's worth stressing that cooperatives are actually really, really mainstream. So more than 12% of humanity is part of any of the 3 million cooperatives across the world. The largest 300 cooperatives report a total turnover of over $2,000 billion US, according to the last World Cooperative Monitor in 2019, which tries to gather as much data about the cooperative economy as they can, but they don't actually capture everything. The cooperatives also contribute to sustainable economic growth. And I realize this is a point of debate whether economic growth should be pursued or not, but I'll just leave that to one side for now. But they also produce stable and high quality employment, employing over 280 million people across the globe. In other words, 10% of the world's employed population. And it's also an international movement. So it's an international source of expertise. You have the International Cooperative Alliance, the International Labour Organization that promote cooperation and cooperatives. But cooperators also look beyond national boundaries and national borders. And I think that's also an important source of its strength and resilience. Yet discussion of their role in public debate is often quite limited. And that's why it's great to see an event like this evening's. This is something that was flagged up by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, who made the point that essentially quite often what's lacking from a policymaker's toolkit is an ability to imagine cooperation, actually. So they don't think in terms of policy solutions that people can be trusted to kind of self-organize and do so voluntarily, of which she cites cooperation as a great example of a kind of self-organization model. And she says the reason for this is until a theoretical explanation based on human choice for self-organized and self-governed enterprises is fully developed and accepted, major policy decisions will continue to be undertaken with a presumption that individuals cannot organize themselves and always need to be organized by external authorities. And I think this is where a historical perspective then is really interesting and really important, because actually we have a long history here in Ireland of actually doing that ourselves. Often out of necessity, but then actually it transforms into something very long lasting, very successful, but sadly, I would say somewhat diminished in recent decades. So we go right back to the 19th century, even beforehand. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term of the mehel, this kind of the Irish word for informal cooperation, where communities and neighbours help one another. And this is something that is often cited within kind of rural and agrarian economies. They don't function unless people help one another. We're not a group of individuals trying to screw each other over all the time. I think that's important to remember. You have a series of then in early 19th century kind of utopian experiments that take place across the United Kingdom, the United States, and one in Ireland. They're kind of seen as Owenite cooperative experiments. They're an attempt to create cooperative communes where the workers themselves run and share in the profits of whatever the activity is that they're engaged in. So in the early 1830s in Rallahine in County Clare, you have the very interesting case of the Vandeleur family, who are kind of quite taken by Owen's kind of cooperative utopia, and they turned their whole kind of landed estate into a cooperative commune. So the tenant farmers are sharing the profits, they're kind of running it as a co-op, but it lasts for 3 years because Vandeleur himself is a notorious gambler, and he bets the farm one night, and the commune comes crashing down after 2 to 3 years. But nevertheless, it kind of maintains a sort of important significance for, should we say, radical thinkers within the Irish context. So James Connolly cites Rallahine in his history of Irish labour, but George Russell, who becomes a propagandist for the cooperative movement, also points to Rallahine as an example of what Irish people can do with their kind of left to their own devices. So the cooperative movement really flourishes in the late 19th century, and there are obviously some very obvious reasons why that might be the case. So giving you some of that sort of social context, many of you are probably already familiar with this, so I won't labour the point. You know, there's 50 years essentially between Rallahine and the next wave of cooperative activity. Part of the reason that cooperatives become so important is because of the structural changes that occur in Ireland in the wake of An Gorta Mór, the Great Famine, which changes everything. And, you know, looking historically, we're still dealing with the fallout of the famine, frankly. So you have consistently high levels of emigration from the countryside. You have agricultural depression then in the 1870s, which sees a collapse in food prices. And in Ireland, you have the added element of increased rent defaults, evictions. And rural Ireland then becomes perched precariously on the edge of another famine in the late 1870s, early 1880s, which of course coincides and perhaps propels the activity, much of it in the west of Ireland around the land war. At the same time in the 1880s, Ireland, which is seen as the main supplier of butter to Britain, is being ousted from that market by the Danes, who are producing a much higher quality butter. And the reason they've done that is because they've adopted the co-op model to kind of create a much higher quality dairy products. So there is a sense then that there's a catastrophic rural crisis unfolding in Ireland in the late 19th century. And that is what motivates this individual, who maybe many of you are familiar with from history textbooks and days at school, Horace Plunkett, who is the third son of Lord Dunsany, which is based in Meath. And interestingly, the current Lord Dunsany, I see, has rewilded that whole estate at the moment. So interesting things afoot there still. He moves to America in the 1870s and returns to Ireland a decade later. And it's unclear why he settles upon the cooperative principle. There are probably a few factors that kind of propel him in that direction, but he's really concerned with what he sees as this problem of rural life. And he sees the cooperative model as a way to kind of transition out of that. So he wants to build sustainable rural communities. He uses the word sustainable, I suppose, in a different way that we might use it today. He's talking about making sure that people are anchored in their local communities and that they have jobs and that they can achieve happiness and happy lives. So you would see that better business being linked to a better life. And he basically establishes the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society in 1894, today's known as ICOS, to basically promote and propel and expand the cooperative sector, which is largely based around the Danish model, which is focused on dairy produce. So this is where you get the cooperative creamery. And that expands quite rapidly in the late 90s, from the 1890s onwards. He's also a politician, so he's the MP for South Dublin between 1892 and 1900. Which time he also establishes the Irish Department of Agriculture in 1900. So he actually gets Irish agricultural policy making sent back from Westminster to Dublin, and it's kind of referred to in 1900 as Home Rule in the Dairy. So this is over 2 decades before any form of Irish independence, but you do have a nominally independent Irish Minister for Agriculture. So agricultural policy making powers come to Ireland very early because of Plunkett. So he's hated politically, nationalists hate him, unionists hate him, but he's actually very successful, I would argue. This also fits into this wider ethos of self-help that's taking place in this period. I won't labour this point either. But, you know, it's essentially you have the Gaelic revival, you have the rise of the GAA, Sinn Féin, the Irish literary movement. And I think the cooperative movement needs to be understood as part of this kind of much wider cultural explosion that's taking place at this moment. This really is an economic sort of analog to all this very, very exciting activity that's taking place. And just to give a sense, really, I suppose, of the rapid expansion of the movement. As I say, the movement itself is based around the cooperative creamery, but there are other types of societies as well that emerge. So you have early forms of credit unions, you have agricultural stores, you have poultry societies, you have some flax making societies. But as I say, the butter making is really the kind of the beating heart of the movement, really. And you see there, you get a sense of the spread. By 1909, the country is completely covered with cooperative societies. By 1920, you have over 160,000 cooperative members across Ireland, and they would usually nominally be the heads of households. So the reach of the co-op movement is much higher than 158,000 people, or however many people are mentioned there. It kind of reaches really deeply into every sort of seam of social and economic life in Ireland. And again, you know, Plunkett does link the Irish question to the rural question. And he says to outside observers is the question of rural life, a question which is assuming a social and economic importance, not just only for Ireland, north and south, but for almost the whole civilized world. And, you know, he's taken on as an advisor to American presidents to help them define what a rural policy should look like. So his ideas are taken up across the globe. Ireland is really kind of at the heart of this interesting experiment and how you can save the countryside with cooperatives. So it's interesting to think about that with the theme that's present tonight. It was resisted though by a lot of people. This was not uncontroversial. Shopkeepers don't like the co-op movement, and they kind of have debt networks that they've kind of built up with lots of rural people, and the co-op can kind of act as a way to sort of cut the middleman out, or sometimes called the gone-bean man. In fact, the co-op movement makes a big play about gone-beanism, like cooperation is there to kind of eliminate gone-beanism. Butter traders and private creameries don't like co-ops because, of course, they're competitors for their business and they tend to be much more successful. Nationalists, by which I mean the Irish Parliamentary Party, hate them because they see Plunkett being guilty of placing economics before politics. Manchester's co-op movement also dislikes them because they're competing for cheap butter for people who live in cities like Manchester and London. So they want to pay farmers as little as possible in order to pass on the savings to their members. The Irish movement is worth saying is kind of set up to kind of increase the prosperity of producers. So what happens very quickly is you get this binary, which I think we need to avoid actually, between producers and consumers. So they're pitted against each other, and the producer interest wins out in the early 20th century. And just I won't label this either. This is a kind of a view from British cooperators. Oh no, this is an Irish cooperative organisers explanation to people who are thinking about starting a co-op about how British cooperation works. So they link it very much to the kind of the national liberation struggle that's emerging. So you see there, the English concern, the English co-op ties their farmers hand and foot into the English institution. And the task of the Irish co-op movement is to liberate farmers from, I suppose, British tyranny. So cooperation doesn't always get on with cooperators don't always cooperate with each other. You have then the War of Independence attacks on the co-op movement. They're targeted because they are so successful, the beating heart of many communities. So the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and the Crown Forces generally target co-ops after there would be IRA activity in the local area. And this was a way to punish the whole community. So you kind of get this kind of creates an outcry in Britain. You know, this is it's seen as an attack on innocent people. So images like this were portrayed quite commonly from people who are trying to critique British policy in Ireland. And well, after independence, there's really essential the Irish state has got to help the co-op movement to kind of secure the gains. So you have a series of legislation passed in the 1920s, the Dairy Produce Act, the creation of a dairy disposal company, which kind of holds on to failing private creameries and then tries to pass them on to the cooperative sector. You have the Creamery Act, which gives the Department of Agriculture greater control over the development of the movement. But by the 1920s, the co-ops dominate the Irish dairy sector, which is kind of goes on until the 1960s, 1970s. We have this guy, Ken Whitaker, who is often presented as a hero of modern Ireland. I suppose he might be seen as maybe one of the architects that helps neoliberalize the economy. But one thing he's trying to do is increase you know, I won't go through the whole program for economic expansion, but one of the things he's trying to do is to kind of increase the supply of international interest in the Irish economy, move it away from just national production to the supply of an international marketplace. And this new economic plan basically relies on the decline of the small farmer in the favor of consolidation and intensification, which is pursued in the 1960s by the Department of Agriculture. So they have this report, the NAP report, which argues that the state should actually spend more money supporting co-ops. But the Department of Agriculture says, no, this is too biased. Actually, what we need to do is make bigger co-op creameries, turn them into kind of much larger conglomerations. And this meets with lots of local opposition, particularly in the west of Ireland. So, for example, North Connaught Farmers Co-op, which would have been where my family would have been based and worked for years, emerges out of amalgamations of local creameries in Sligo, Mayo, Roscommon, Leitrim and Galway. And I think it's a Revo, but it's still a co-op actually, but it's much huger and people feel further away. So I think there's something to do about community and the scale and the size of these enterprises that is important. But by the 70s, you have this kind of 150 co-op creameries reduced down to 33 in 1990. Entry into the European single market basically requires food processors to become more profitable. Ireland decides to go down the multinational PLC model, and it looks to raise investment capital. So Kerry PLC in the 1980s is set up, and it's a movement away from the cooperative model. Privatization is viewed as the most effective way to scale up the agricultural sector. And you have the entrance of characters like Larry Goodman, who buys out one of the big co-ops, Baileyborough in Cavan, becomes one of the kind of items within the Goodman international empire. And you also have the role of supermarkets who are also putting another form of pressure on because they want cheap food at whatever cost. So these are a series of pressures. And, you know, Irish agriculture is great for international investors. So this is from 2019, where you get a sense of how cooperative the Kerry group actually is. It's 13% shareholder analysis as the co-op by the end of 2019. That has shrank again since, I believe, and is looking to shrink even more. And if you get a look at the kind of the international institutional shareholders, which account to 60%, 2% of that is Irish capital. So when people say it's time to put on the green jersey, this kind of really is a sense that there's not much Irish capital really kind of filtering around some of these great multinational stories that we celebrate. So farmers themselves are increasingly divorced from these profit-making enterprises, which is a very sad story, I think, from the perspective of trying to shore up the cooperative sector. But there is hope, I think, and it might come from the other really successful aspect of the co-op movement, which is the credit union sector. Ireland has a real problem here in terms of the fact that it's a very, very successful sector, but most of the money it holds can't be used for socially valuable investments. That idea of being valuable to the community. The Central Bank of Ireland has actually over-regulated the credit union sector to make it near impossible for them to get the money on their books, basically financing socially productive enterprises like co-ops, renewable energy, organic farming, worker co-ops, worker buyouts, community assets. And quite often it's said, you know, the central bank has to regulate, but these kind of regulations were also imposed on the American credit union model, the Australian and the Canadian, and they just through legislation managed to kind of liberate our savings to kind of, you know, to fund that kind of socially important investment. So that's something to think about, I think, maybe in terms of a financial strategy. How do we use the credit union sector to kind of transition to the sort of rural communities we want to see? And Fianna Fáil actually has a very interesting manifesto promise in 2020, where they want to set up a community investment fund to create community-owned assets, including cooperatives, you know, football pitches, swimming pools, important assets actually that could be cooperativized and kind of add to that kind of revitalization of rural areas. Obviously they're in government, so maybe we'll see that happen, maybe. So conclusions, hopefully I've not rambled on too much. Basically, what I think we're living through is a return of Plunkett's rural crisis, although we have, you know, maybe different iterations and different questions to think about. It's, in some ways, the questions are also kind of, there's lots of continuities to try and deal with. I would argue that agriculture needs more economic democracy. You know, co-ops, to use a phrase that's been used a lot in the past 5 to 10 years, they actually help people take back control in a meaningful way. They kind of give them empowerment over their own lives, careers, livelihoods. And co-ops become anchored in local communities, which is kind of a buzzword now of the community wealth building program, which I think is very exciting. But co-ops have been doing this for a long, long time. I mean, I guess they are the original cooperative community wealth builders. They I think one thing to avoid the trap is kind of avoid this binary of producers versus consumers. It's quite a seductive message and people can fall into the trap of it quite a lot, but we need to try and build maybe those lines of connections that I think that people like Evonne has got to be talking about between the consumers and producers. I think that's absolutely crucial. We need the promotion of the inter-co-op solidarity. Yes, we have ICOS still, but on its own, it won't be enough. And actually I mentioned before we start this evening, this wonderful day that was set up to showcase Irish cooperatives on the 1st of July for International Cooperative Day, and ICOS and many of the agricultural co-ops were the only kind of voice that was lacking from that discussion, which I think was regrettable. You know, we have the huge reserves of cooperative credit that I've mentioned. We could use the co-op sector to grow the renewable energy sector. We need to educate people and, you know, promote why the cooperative advantage is crucial to success. And Ireland used to have this in the 80s. They had the cooperative development unit that helped workers buy out failing businesses and turn them into worker cooperatives. That got canned in 2002. It might be an idea thinking about how we might want to bring that back. Might want to think about what role co-ops can play in a just transition. So one of the questions around, say, board pneumonia, I mean, are we just got to give people who have been fired, essentially lost their livelihoods, you know, some kind of vouchers for retraining and skills? I mean, there is interesting things that could be done with a worker co-op model, I would argue, in that area. And the Marcora law, I mean, I'm very interested in the Italian cooperative movement. They have this wonderful law that was started in the 1990s that really, the state plays a very, very active role in supplying funds and supports and you know, loans to help workers transition maybe family firms, failing firms into very, very successful worker cooperatives. And actually, these are worker co-ops that have had long, long lives. They're kind of very, very sustainable, very, very resilient despite the financial crisis. And it might be something that, you know, it could be a long-term idea, but it could be something that we should maybe think about in terms of how we can support the cooperative sector to grow. And I'll stop there. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for that. I know it's well done. I know you could probably talk for a lot longer than that, but it's great to get such a concise, to get so much into 15 to 20 minutes. So well done, and we'll hear a lot more from you now. So I'm going to bring in our three panelists. Just welcome to everyone who has joined us since Patrick started, and just to remind you that we are recording. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. But one of the things that stood out there, and I suppose we all know this, was this sort of corporatization of the co-ops. And one of the things, like the Kerry one, where they really floated as a PLC. So Gerry, I'd like to talk to you as a farmer and to see what does that kind of feel like on the ground in terms of your day-to-day farming, like we'll say since that time over the last couple of decades. Has it gotten harder, or how's that been for you?
Well, of course it has got harder because you're all the time dealing with corporations now, whether it be a livestock market, well, not so much a livestock market, but a factory, or if you're in dairy industry, of course, it's a dairy co-op, and you're a price taker at all times, and that is that is a big problem. That is, you know, that is the way that things has changed from where we were at to where we're at today, and in that sense, that you don't have, you know, choice as regards the sale of your product, really. Insofar as the profit that you could make, or even producing a better product, like for example, chemical free or whatever you want to, whatever you wanted to do. But agriculture has revived, like since I was a young fella, the way agriculture has gone full circle now. Farmers have no control whatsoever on, you know, what they're doing and what they're producing. They work from morning to night, and they take whatever is an offer at the time. You know, when you need money, you have to sell. And anyhow, you know, if you have surplus animals, you have to sell. So like you're caught, it's not something you can say, well, I'll hold on for 2 months or 3 months or 4 months or whatever. You know, there's always a deadline, and you have to take the price. And like I would see huge benefit in co-ops and them, you know, villages or parishes or whatever, working together, producing, you know, locally, selling locally, all that type of thing. It would inject huge competition, you know, into the whole thing, rather than, you know, what we're doing at the moment. And I cannot see, like, if something is not done, all you're going to have is more and more farmers leaving the land, more and more rural decline, because farmers can't make ends meet now. You know, Solace at the minute, just for example, the cattle are a fairly good trade at the moment, but that'll be short-lived. And when the Australian market starts supplying into GB, well, that's going to have a massive detrimental effect on the beef sector here. You know, but I would be very much in favour of the idea. I would be very much in favour of extensive farming practices, chemically-free food, we produce less and produce it better, sold locally and supplied locally. And I think that's why I'd be very much in favour of the idea of cooperatives.
And just to clarify, Gerry, when you were talking about being a price taker, is it because there's less places to sell to, or is it what has made you into the price taker, we'll say, as opposed to maybe 25 years ago or 30 years ago?
Well, look, it's all sewn up by the Goodman Group. It's quite simple because they have control of 75% of the offal. And I know a factory in Ballinrobe that was given 4 cents a kilo more for beef there a couple of years ago, and they got a phone call saying, look, bring back your beef to what it's supposed to be, or you'll be left with your offal. Like, Goodman has full control when he's 75%. And that control was given to him by Simon Coveney with the stroke of a pen. That's where that's at. Like, so on about, you know, beef protests and protest gates and all that, a waste of time, pure nonsense. Like, you know, as Goodman has control, it's been given to him politically from a political, you know, and it seems to be no into what he can do or what he can buy, and there's no problem with anything in the EU with the competition authority or anything like that. It's just sail on. Okay,
so just to follow on from that, Bridget, I might just go over to you there and just get a different perspective, because you're involved with Talamh Bio, and I know Talamh Bio are trying to come at this from a different angle a lot of the time, aren't you? And what sort of challenges are your members getting in this? And is it less to do with beef, or is it more to do with the fruit and veg and produce like that?
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, look, Talamh Bio is quite a small organization, and it's starting to grow. I would say that its original core started off in people that were more horticulture orientated, perhaps a smaller farm, and quite a lot of them not in any way linked into the cap payments. They would have actually been external to that. And I mean, I'd like to kind of pick up on that somewhere along the line, because I think cap has played an incredible role in where we're at. But Talamh Bio, I mean, in terms of the farmers on the ground, basically we need to start looking at a local food policy. Talamh Bio is going to actually be launching their local food policy at the end of the month, so I'd ask people to keep an eye out for it. But it's about looking at creating pathways for local food production through a positive policy framework, which would incorporate your income supports, your labor and finance incentives, your pilot projects for land access, your short supply chains and supports and infrastructure. Now, what's really interesting when you start even looking at food sovereignty and what underpins it, and you match that to those values that Patrick was describing, that Plunkett and everybody used from Senate's days, you know, the concern for the community, and kind of like, I mean, there were senses of kind of like democracy and whatever. There's a whole bunch of that stuff that needs to be reinfused back into the way we work and the structures that we generate. But I think that Patrick kind of talked on something as well. I know I'm just going to go a bit off the question you asked there, but you know, until such time as we need each other in this country, I think that farmers and the kind of structure is not actually going to lend itself to people coming together towards that cooperative movement. The moment you kind of see a crisis like we're seeing now with the COVID, or if we saw, you know, something really, really brutal around, say, food supply is really starting to get short, that's when people pull together. We see people then learning the value again of a sense of community, of depending on each other, of depending on their networks and whatever. And I suppose that's what Talamh Bio in its day-to-day work is trying to kind of engender. As farmers are working together, they're starting to actually need each other, learning from each other, that whole information and education, educating and training each other. So a lot of those kind of ideas are being built into Talamh Bureau's practices, so that on a day-to-day basis, even if, I mean, I think the iterations that we're going to see of the organizations coming out might not look like the old cooperatives. You know, you've got CSAs, you've got the cooperative movement, you've got the Open Food Network, you've got a whole bunch of kind of really creative stuff that's starting to happen. But it'll be based around the kind of specific context that people are in now.
Okay, that's interesting what you were saying about
sitting there designing that food frame.
And what you were saying about people needing each other is an important point. But what's important is that when you do have these crises, that things are organized and ready to go, that we're not just falling on our arse. Pardon the French. So on that, I'd like to bring you in, Evonne, because you're involved with the Open Food Network, and you are just currently and actively, very much so, you're doing something and creating a framework that I suppose people can follow. You're linking up consumers and producers. Will you just tell us for a minute exactly what it is you do and the benefits that brings to producers and consumers?
Sure, yeah. So the Open Food Network, it's actually an international platform, but it's more than a platform. It's a movement really around connecting local food producers with their local consumers and markets. The platform itself is an open source platform. It's community owned, and we came together about this time last year. People from the CSA movement, from Transition Towns, Dublin Food Co-op, and I came from, I suppose, a community activism and consumer perspective. I live in a large urban centre with almost 4.5, not 5 of the big multiples here, and I can't get local veg handy in the town centre. So we came together about this time last year, and we deployed the platform in Ireland August, September of last year, and we have incorporated as a cooperative since then. But our goal, I suppose, is to establish a solidarity co-op, which brings together the range of stakeholders that are involved in the local food system, if you like. So from the producers to the consumers, to the wider community, the CSAs, you know, all of the stakeholders that have an important role to play in that whole process. So the platform itself is basically designed to give food producers a tool that they can use to their own, you know, to meet their own specific needs. It's quite flexible, but it's a shop front effectively, where they can list their produce, determine to you know, the price they want to sell it at, determine the volumes they want to sell. They can sell directly themselves as individuals, but most interestingly, I think, in terms of the potential for Ireland, is they can come together in food hubs. You know, the platform allows them it gives visibility and transparency around who the producers are in a certain location. And the idea is then that communities ideally would come together and establish their own community food hubs, where they bring in all of the local producers from the area, using the platform as a tool. It's a tool, and then you know, ensure their own access to the quality local food that's around them, and give their local producers the security of that small supply chain and the connection with their local consumers, and the, you know, the various benefits of that gives them. So, you know, for the I suppose the only way we could possibly organize this particular initiative was via cooperative. You know, it would be crazy to think that any other model would be appropriate really for this, you know. And, you know, I mentioned at the outset that I'm certainly not a co-op veteran, but it makes absolute sense that this is the way that we have to organize ourselves if we want to empower ourselves and bring back those very, very key and relevant values that Patrick mentioned at the beginning, you know. And I think, you know, I fell into the trap myself as well. You know, people can have an idea that co-ops they're a rural thing, they're a solution for rural communities. And, you know, even the images that Patrick threw up there at the beginning, you know, it's the cows, the creamery, and and all of that, but like they have such potential and such relevance for our communities, our urban communities as well. You know, we're really facing what I think is a crisis of imagination in terms of how we organize ourselves as communities. And we need to find a way to pull together in a way that meets our very real needs around food, around energy, all of the things that are you know, facing us, those challenges that are facing us. And as you say, Colm, if we haven't got those building blocks in place, if we don't relearn how to collaborate as communities, we're going to be found wanting when those challenges do arrive. They don't give warning. The shelves can be bare from one day to the next, as we know, but just simple snowstorms. So I think, you know, the opportunities that co-ops provide are vast and very, very relevant today.
And just for a bit of clarification as well, from your experience, I was looking through some of your producers, but what would you say the uptake is like from, we'll say, things like beef and dairy, in that with you guys, or do they tend to do their own thing and deal with the regular channels?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much early days for us at the moment, to be honest. So I suppose a lot of our take up so far has been from producers that are maybe already connected through the CSA network or the Organic Trust, or, you know, regenerative farming, those type of communities. And there are also a number of community hubs that have gone out and just, you know, brought their local producers on board for the purpose of selling through their hubs. And that's purely on the basis of the fact that they're nearby and they're quality producers, and you know, obviously it would be attractive to them to have the local outlet. So yeah, I mean, it's for everybody. Effectively, it's for all local producers. So and I see a value for everybody. I mean, Gerry, I suppose, will be able to say, you know, better in that regard. I mean, I'm not a producer, but for me, it makes sense. It makes total sense from what I understand as the risks and challenges of food producers today. You know.
Yeah. So
You know,
just going back to
sorry.
something. Go on, Bridget. Yeah, no, go on.
No, I was actually just wanting to hop in there and kind of say, you know, from the producer or the farmer's point of view, to be able to engage in an opportunity like that, we need, first of all, to get institutional recognition for local food producers to start with. You know, we need to kind of look, as I say, at a policy framework that allows you to kind of access certain support, so that you can kind of get started straight away. You know, as you mentioned, it would be your regenerative farmers, your organic farmers. If somebody is going to be producing local food, if it's very, very local, yes, if the people know you and they know how you farm, you can build up that level of trust with people, and you might not need the certification. But if you're wanting to sell it on a bit more wholesale, or you're wanting to kind of put it onto your network, you would want to kind of send it with that certification that it ticks the boxes of you're going to be eating chemical-free food, etc., etc. And so I suppose to allow that to happen, you start needing this multi-department integrated approach to start being able to kind of generate that. You know, a lot of these kind of farmers, as Gerry said, are kind of locked into a system, and literally you can't hold it, as he was saying, you can't hold a cow for longer. You've got this margin of time you have to sell it. The thought then of how you would yourself kind of take it that step further to get it into a product, if there's no support for it there, and there is no support at this stage under the kind of current system for the small farmer to make that kind of conversion.
And they're so busy getting through the year, I suppose, as well.
Well, just trying to survive economically. You know, sometimes when you're literally just treading water, to diversify takes both a risk, but it takes certain resources, and a lot of those resources aren't there. And it goes back maybe to what I was saying about a very uneven distribution of things like CAP resources. That is designed to keep kind of farmers just feeding the system as it stands, not allowing them that option to slow down and say, wait, hold on a moment, I don't want to do it this way.
Yeah. So Gerry, when I was chatting to you on the phone there, when I
Is everybody else present but our host left?
Yeah, I think Colin's internet kind of
He's on ACL, to be
yeah,
fair.
yeah, he is an ARG-GL, yeah, so kind of comes in and out. Yeah.
He'll be back in a minute.
I can cut in there maybe and just comment on what Bridget was saying there, just about the challenges facing, you know, the producers. I think there's an onus on communities now as well, I think, to step up and try and shoulder a bit of that that challenge as well. You know, we need to recognize that we need our local producers, we need local food systems, and you know, it's about stepping up and supporting them, recognizing the value and in a practical way. And I think that, you know, if we recognize that we need our local food producers, then, you know, the hubs that I'm talking about is a real practical way of demonstrating that support, you know. And I hope that communities will start to realize that that's a really practical way that they can help to shoulder some of that burden and that risk as well, because, you know, a lot of our local food producers, they simply don't have the bandwidth to try and hunt out those local markets that they're there, but they're obscured, you know. And hopefully one of the things that the OFM will do is will shine a light on them, bring them out into the open and help them to demonstrate the demand that I think is there, and, you know, support their local producers in that way. Gerry, does that sound uplifting? Am I giving you some hope?
Yeah, I don't know if you may hope or not, but to get things like this up and running in the community, my question would be, you know, we have the average age of Irish farmers now, I think, is about 57 years. So we have to turn to the younger generation, a lot of them haven't worked on farms and they know very little about it. And how do we get around that problem? I often think about that.
The CSA model, I think, is a really good example of how, you know, we can involve communities practically in the farm itself, you know, and it is a problem because, you know, certainly in urban communities, people are not used to seeing a bit of dirt on their veg, you know. It's a bit of a challenge, and, you know, issues like seasonality and all of that, and, you know, the risks that can happen if the weather turns at the wrong time of the year and all of that. Urban consumers certainly have a really poor understanding these days, I think, of those issues, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then, look at not just urban people has known that, you know, they have a very poor understanding of the way food is produced, where it comes from, how it's so much chemicals involved, all of that type of thing. You know, they don't really know what they're eating, like, and that's a fact. And I think that's a place that would, you know, I think would be sort of a starting point as to getting that information out, first of all, to even both urban and rural areas, because people do not realise what they're buying in the shop or what they're buying in a butcher or in the supermarkets and all these places, because it's junk, as we all know, a lot of it. Like, but the general public doesn't realise that, and they think it's great because it's cheap. But, like, you know, we see all the new diseases, we see all the people that are sick, we see all the cancer that's going around the place, and a lot of it is a certain amount of that coming from chemically produced food. There has to be, there's no doubt in my mind. You know, chicken, for example, I wouldn't eat chicken now if you paid me, like, you know, since I got to know how it is produced and full of antibiotics and all this carry on. I just simply wouldn't eat it for love for money. You know, but there's a lot of people that, I don't know, people in general doesn't take interest in these things. You know, it's amazing me, I was saying, people, you know, they go from day to day and week to week, and they never look into anything like that, or, you know, they just don't take it.
I think, Gerry, though, a big factor there is the way things are marketed. Like, so when you know, you don't buy meat with a picture of them injecting antibiotics up in a feedlot. They'll have a picture of Gerry Loftus on the side of Nathan, and, you know, a dog and 2 cows, and them as healthy as could be. So a lot of it is the marketing, and I think that's a strength in the kind of thing you were talking about when you were saying to me there about like a Mayo beef brand, you know, and things like that you get the Mayo beef farmers come together, and this is a brand. Now, I know it's a great idea, as you were saying, why hasn't this happened? But why do you think things like that aren't happening?
Well, I don't know. Is there any effort? Is there enough effort? I don't think there's enough effort gone into it, to be honest. And I don't think there's enough information being got out. And I don't think there's been enough of trying. Like, who has bothered to ever try to do it? Like, you know, I don't think anybody has really. There are small producer groups, you know, for lamb and little bits and pieces here and there, but there was never really a campaign launched in getting the information out, what we are eating and what we could be eating and all of that type of thing, you know?
Yeah. So do you think it's just that things aren't bad enough yet for a lot of farmers? Is that it?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Things are going to get worse for farmers in their own way, because in one way they're going to get worse, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because they're not preparing themselves for the changes that are coming, and it's virtually impossible to get them to listen. Now, the changes that are coming, of course, will benefit the environment, which it badly needs to do, water quality, climate change, all that type of stuff. But what you'll hear from farmers, that won't happen. I said, they cannot do that. You know, that couldn't happen. You know, that's the lingo. And the problem we have, and someone there made a great point, Patrick, I think it was, whoever it was, until farmers and people need one another, they're not going to see the light. Because loyalty is gone out of rural Ireland. There's no doubt in my mind about that. When I was a young fella, if there was a problem in a house in the parish, it was everybody's problem. And it's not like that today. You're lucky if it's your next door neighbour's problem today. You know, everybody, if there's somebody sick, there'll be a load of people around the place doing work or whatever that was going on, or someone died or whatever. That's completely changed today. And people, and I think a lot of the reason for that is that there was a time of day when people were dependent on one another, and 4 or 5 neighbours did the work together, they brought in the hay, they saved the hay, whatever. But since they got the money in the brown envelope, as we do say, since the cap money started coming, they became less reliant on one another and more dependent on money in the brown envelope. And that changed the dynamics and the whole setup of traditional rural Ireland, in my view. And that is going to change back now. Money won't be as easy to be got anymore. You will have to do certain things. You'll have to do a lot of things, actually, to draw down your payments now. You know, so you see, this is what's coming, and to get farmers to see that and believe that, and, you know, to wake up to it, it's difficult. It's very difficult now. I know from talking to them a lot, you know.
Well, I'm going to follow on there a tiny bit from Gerry. Sorry to jump in, because I mean, I know I mentioned the cap earlier on, but you know, if you are a farmer, and especially up and down the northwestern seaboard, the first thing you know is that the cap payments aren't fair, and they certainly aren't equal. You know, I mean, some people, if you had a look at the average payment, some people get fractions of that average, and some people get multiples of that average. And those kind of divide and rule tactics really did splinter farmers completely. You know, it splintered their ability to, as Gerry said, to work together, to actually see themselves as a community, because now you either looked at if you were in the low category, you're resentful towards the people who've got. And if you're in the high category, you're quite happy to be coining the extra money, and you sure as hell not going to give up any of it. So you start, you know, there's this distrust, there's this resentment, there's this lack of cooperation that just started getting fostered around, as Gerry said, the envelope that would be coming out to you. And some people just didn't need other people anymore. So, I mean, where, Colm, you said, you know, what are some of the things we can do to make sure that we're a bit more prepared for when we do hit one of those big crises, that we better able to kind of respond to it? The one thing would be that I really do think that we need to push very, very hard for full convergence right now on the cap. Give everybody the same opportunities, especially seeing as we having to do new things with that money. And if we're going to have to be kind of giving a lot more to environmental outcomes, it's extremely unfair to leave the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, with the smallest budget and ask them to do exactly the same that you're asking somebody else who can actually afford it, you know? And then the other thing is that you'll always kind of hear right the way from Brussels all the way down to you know, a local office, is that special status that's given to agriculture because of its important social and economic role of feeding the world. We actually absolved or well, we're just not held accountable to the rules that a whole bunch of other people or sectors are held accountable to. So we even saw that coming through in the climate bill, where straight away they argued that the special nature of agriculture due to its importance, and so we need to factor in biogenic methane, etc., etc. And it's time to move away from that very old argument, especially seeing as when we say we excused from having to be fair, we excused from having to deal with inequality and whatever, because we're feeding the world. If we asked ourselves, what are we feeding the world? When it comes to stockpiling milk powder and then flooding the market with that, or mozzarella for junk food. This is not, I mean, we're not actually feeding the world healthily. If you go onto YouTube, all you have to do is tap on a really nice thing. It was kind of, I think it's called How the World Got Obese. And you can watch a time lapse of watching the globe somewhere between the 1980s and 2014 literally become obese and sick. And that is exactly through what we producing as food and how we're feeding that to people. So I mean, I do think if there were two things that we could really do right now to make a massive difference to actually, and I'm not saying level that playing field, I'm talking about pointing a way to the new pitch, it would be to demand that we need fairness and equality in those cap payments, and we need to get rid of, or we need to stop hiding behind the special status of agriculture.
Okay, so just, sorry, Patrick, now I meant to bring you back in sooner, but just listening to everybody there, and I see some interesting questions coming in, and we'll bring people in now. But just after listening to everyone there, Patrick, and given like the historical perspective, what would you say would be the next step forward in terms of really trying to mainstream a lot of farmers into a cooperative movement? And while you're at it, what would you say would be the main barriers?
Well, thinking historically, I mean, the first thing is going back to the days of Plunkett and George Russell. Well, two things there. The first is it was bloody hard work that went on for years and years. And if you read the diaries of Horace Plunkett, you know, he addresses many, many meetings just to vast indifference. But it's only when those kind of very small shoots of success start happening in places like Donegal or parts of Limerick, and one or two success stories break out, that other farmers kind of see what benefit can accrue to them and to their community, and they kind of are more willing to buy into it. I think that's important. The second thing I would say is, and again, it's not a short-term fix, or it's a much thinking about it in a much longer-term perspective, which I'm afraid historians do, which sometimes annoys policymakers, I guess. But people like George Russell, I called the book Civilising Rural Ireland, and that I got a bit of blowback one evening on Twitter for saying that, because, you know, kind of like an urban academic kind of like telling rural Ireland what to do. But what I actually meant by the title was these were the words of like George Russell and Horace Plunkett, where they actually envisaged what they were doing. They weren't just creating small businesses in the countryside. They were building something new and modern and exciting, and it was a kind of a new way of envisaging what it meant to live in the Irish countryside, and indeed the countryside everywhere. And I think the story has to be positive as well, that you're telling people. Like, you have to kind of give people some hope, and you have to say that it's not just about mitigating a drop in cap payments. What we're actually doing here, we're involved in a much broader project that might be the sort of thing that does create a moment where younger people stay in rural areas. I mean, it's quite interesting to me at this moment, you know, this COVID-19 moment. Who knows where it'll end? It could end somewhere quite bleak, or it could be something that's actually a moment where people kind of press the reset button. And, you know, we're seeing young people go back to maybe some of the smaller towns, leaving Dublin. And I'm talking about my friends here as well, for different reasons as well, because of the housing crisis. We won't go there tonight. But, you know, there is something that people are stepping back and saying, I want to live a life that has value and meaning and has community. So there might be an opportunity there to think about, actually, rural Ireland has an opportunity to actually kind of become populated again. It's got to require a lot of thinking and policy about how you do that. But I think it has to be fit around a kind of a positive story about positive transformation. And, you know, people taking responsibility as well. That's the other thing about the cooperative principle, is that people have to work to build it. It doesn't just fall into your lap. The state can't just say, here's some funds to create a cooperative movement. You have to work hard. And that means attending meetings, it means disagreeing. But actually, I find, having attended many co-op meetings myself now at this stage, those moments of disagreement, those moments where you think, oh, this is a falling out between some people here that actually could be insuperable, it can't be conquered, is actually so healthy and important to the functioning of that small economic democracy. Just people having the place to kind of air their grievance and say, I disagree with this decision that the co-op's taking, but the fact there's a vote on it and their peers engage in it and debate with them, and they feel valued and respected in a way that actually, Kerry PLC doesn't do. I mean, the farmers are up in arms around the direction Kerry PLC is taking now in the last few years, but frankly, it's too late. I mean, I think we probably have to let go of Kerry and say that isn't the great story. I mean, that's a story that was told in the 90s and the 2000s about agricultural success. We need to maybe sort of say this is actually a disaster. We need to look elsewhere for our positive stories, but we have to be positive, I think.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep the panel for another few minutes, and then I'm gonna open up to some questions, because I see some very interesting questions coming in. But we are just going to use the hand function. But I'm just going to give you all just one. If you were to say one next step, we'll say, towards really building this cooperative movement in agriculture in Ireland, what would you say that next step might be? And there's no wrong answers.
Well, I think. Well, I'll just jump in first. I think one thing we need to do is we can talk about solidarity between producers and consumers, but I think we need to demonstrate it as well. So the cooperative model has in it the principle that you have concern for the community. So going back to Italy and Macora's law, 3% of every co-op in Italy has to put in 3% of its profits into a national cooperative fund, which is a solidarity fund that then helps provide some of the seed capital and loan capital for new projected cooperative businesses. So, that you can't just maybe expect impoverished young farmers, that there might not be as many of them to kind of like step, and some of them actually are doing multi-jobs. Some of them are farming and teaching and working in various sectors. So there needs to be some kind of solidarity from the rest of the cooperative sector in Ireland. And then it might take a while, but that's how you can maybe grow a movement.
And I think consumers as well, if they're aware of that, are much more likely to put their money into it when they see that, okay, a certain percentage of this is going somewhere else. Okay, that's an excellent one. Gerry, what would you think?
Yeah, well, I'd be very much in favour of starting small, starting local, both urban and rural. And I think maybe to bring people together, or maybe to get it off the ground, a campaign to grow your own, maybe. To see how many people could you get as a starting point to grow on their own. To go down the road of allotments for people in towns and whatever, wouldn't have any land. See how would that go? See how many of them would like to grow their own. And if you could get that up and running, it could very well develop into what we're trying to do, or be a massive help, to forming a cooperative out of maybe that. I don't know. But I do believe that there is not near enough of information got out to people. I think that as well would be critically important to get the ball off the ground. That'd be my idea of starting anyway. And I think if you got it going, if you got it off the ground, I say it should be no problem after that. I won't say no problem, but I think it should be a success.
Okay, Evonne, what do you think? Just your next step.
I suppose similar to what Gerry, coming from the community perspective, I think it's about telling the success stories, sparking imagination, equipping people with the vision that will inspire them to take action. I mentioned earlier that I think there really is a crisis of imagination in our communities, and people want to take action. They want meaning in their lives, as somebody said earlier, and they want to take meaningful action around issues like climate change, and they know that there are issues. There's health issues around the access to healthy food and all of that. So, I think it's about getting the story out there. Co-ops, I think they need a new branding exercise. I think we need to tell people the story of the successful co-ops that are out there at the moment, and the potential and what the model can offer. I think is really important.
Yeah, that's excellent. Bridget, what do you think?
Thinking about Talamh Bio now, but I'd be thinking about food sovereignty, and maybe starting to get that debate out into the communities and start discussing what it is and what it means, and and start seeing how that kind of might provide a seed for growing something on.
Great. There's loads there. So I do see a lot of people putting in questions. So I'm going to open the floor up a bit. Before I do, I want to really thank all our panelists there. There's so much insight and perspective there, and there was things coming up there that I hadn't even thought of. And I know a lot of the people viewing there are from all different backgrounds. So if people want to use the raise hand function and come in, and you can make a comment or ask a question, but I'd ask you to try and keep it just below a minute, and you can direct a question at somebody. But we'll try and keep it moving as much as possible and get everyone going to their beds at 9:25. Okay, so I can't see who has hands up. Sorry now. Can you see those, Julie? Sorry now.
Can I talk?
Go on, yeah. Go ahead, Colm. Yeah.
All right. My background is I'm a dairy farmer, and I'm out of farming now about 10 years. I'm very much involved in the regenerative farming, and that is a big thing that's happening and is not being recognized. And it is going to change farming, not just in how they farm, but in how they educate themselves. It's being done outside the system. And that is a core part of what co-ops must do. They must be autonomous. They must be in charge of their own lives. I was doing some research on the early cooperatives of Mitchelstown, and going back through the letters that the cooperative organization were writing to various other cooperatives and all cooperatives was they were fiercely independent. The centre in Dublin would not tell them that the well was going in the wrong place. That was their decision. Whereas once you started into the free state, into the state, we began to give people grants. And it became the man who was deciding on the grants was the man who decided where the well went. So you lost that autonomy. The credit unions have got nothing from the state, and they are fiercely independent. And I've been involved in various stuff, and I had to look at the cooperative principles, because if there's 7 principles, now I'd ask anyone to call them off the top of your head. It won't be done. I could just about do it after a while. There's only 3 principles that I could find: fairness, autonomy, and mutual development. And those 3 principles give you time to tell everyone this is what you have. If you go beyond that, you've lost them. But all the co-op principles are inside in those 3. And that is what we have to look at. We have to, you're not going to get change from farming establishment. It's not going to happen.
You're saying ideally we start organizing outside of that. And
you're going to have to.
And applying the pressure from there.
I saw a quote recently, Martin Luther King, in one of his last books, Conversations, I think was the name of it. He said, if you're going to get change, you're going to have to produce change, people must be organized to work together in units of power. Units of power is autonomous. If someone can tell you that you shouldn't go to that, then you don't have power. Okay. And that is where the small co-ops come in. We need to start learning how to organize ourselves. And this is where the whole regenerative farming is going to be very much make a big difference in farming, because they're not establishment. They're substantial farmers in it, but they really are doing a good job. But you're saying about what did I say? Feeding the world. Yeah. We're feeding the world, but we're losing the soil. We're losing the biology of the soil.
Yeah. I'm going to keep moving, Connor, because
Okay.
sorry now, I don't mean to put you up, but because I want to get as many people involved as possible.
Yeah.
And I think
That's fine.
again, and thanks for there's so much in there to unpack, even particularly soil. Colin McGinn, did you have your hand up?
Hello, yes, I did. Your last contributor was very interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt him almost, but to Patrick Doyle, I wanted to question him briefly. In your slide, you indicated the penetration of co-ops between 1907 and 1921. I was just curious as to why it was such a low number in the traditional Pale of settlement. And also, your discussion on co-ops in Denmark, are they still existing in Denmark, or has that changed? And also, will you then later explain why co-ops in Ireland essentially became functions of capital owning class and no longer a community? That's my impression anyway of co-ops. And I wanted to mention Spain, Mondragon, and Italy, Emilia-Romagna, and again questioning in Denmark. And then on Gerry Loftus's comment on localization, while I feel very sympathetic in principle to it, and I live in a small town, I can see it being accessible to people such as I, or those of us who live, somewhat locally to farming. But how on earth do we solve this for cities, like Dublin, Limerick, Galway, Cork, Belfast, London, all the rest? And well, yeah, I'd leave it at that.
Okay, do you want to go first there, Patrick?
Yeah, well, very quickly on the question about the Pale, as I said, a lot of the strength of the movement, particularly in its early decades, would have been the creamery, and frankly, the dairy sector was very kind of weak in that area. That would be very much an area where there was a lot of grazing going on, so it was kind of beef fattening territory. So the co-op actually made very, very little inroads in that area until the 1920s, 30s, when the state becomes involved and directs. So you see reports in the 1920s of colonists, of co-operators coming up from North Kerry to settle in Meath and try and stimulate the spread of cooperative societies. It was also to do with the fact that in places like Mitchelstown and places in Cork and Limerick, which have been very, very densely packed dairy pastures, and there was a sense that there may be too many co-ops starting and competing over the same membership. So they wanted to spread that out a little bit. Denmark, so I'm not an expert on Denmark. My understanding is that it's maintained more of its cooperative infrastructure than Ireland. I'd have to check though, so don't quote me on that. Spain and Italy, I mean, Mondragon is it's championed quite a lot now in terms of thinking about new ideas for the bottom up left, which I'm broadly interested in, and it's very much focused on worker co-ops. But very interesting what they do is they have and I think there's questions that have come up in different guises around scale about, can co-ops become too big, and then to what extent are they kind of connected to the local community? I think that's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer for it, but what Mondragon do to escape that, as soon as a co-op hits a certain number of members, it has to split in two and create another one. So it's kind of creating pods of co-ops all the time. And interestingly, when maybe one co-op pods, they're making something that's no longer being bought by people, it's no longer popular, because they have that whole cooperative infrastructure across the region. They redirect workers into other areas where their skills will also fit. It's kind of self-regulating organism. It's very interesting, but it requires a lot of organization, and it's a lot of time, crucially, but there's lots to be learned from Mondragon, I think.
Okay. And Gerry, there was a question in there for you as well.
Didn't see that. What was it?
Sorry, Colin. What you had a question directed at Gerry there?
Well, I felt your comments interesting, Gerry, and I, basically, I'm a lot of agreement with you. My question is just how can essentially small farmers in a cooperative environment feed other than small towns such as the one I live in, which is Oma? I mean, how does it deal with the dynamic of 500,000 people rather than 50,000 people?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a difficult one to answer, but you'd be hoping, would you not, that if we got this cooperative movement off the ground and locally produced food, that bigger farmers might come on board with that type of farming, and they would produce even more. It may not be enough. As regards, it's a big ask. I don't know how we go about that, to be quite honest with you.
Well, then that follows on to the next question. And I mentioned that I am myself a small businessman, and in those terms, a capitalist. But I suggest that the problem is capital, and the problem is ownership. And I can't see you persuading big farmers to change the dynamic where they are the wealthy and somebody else is not wealthy. So there's another political dynamic about to happen, or necessary to happen, for survival. Nothing to remind anything else.
Yeah, somebody told me about, I don't know where I heard it, but I remember somebody telling me about, was it Poland or somewhere in the EU, where, you know, back gardens and front gardens that you won't see flowers or lawns in them, that are all grown something or other. I don't know where I heard that, but I heard somewhere along the line. But it'd be from, I suppose, somewhere along that line you'd have to start, and maybe hopefully get more land involved, and like you would need more land, you know. And then of course there would be new systems of farming coming on board anyway. You know, there's all sorts of different things being talked about now at the moment. So look, it's a difficult one to answer, and to be quite honest about, I don't really know.
And I suppose one of the points, Gerry, that we keep ending up on is that you may not get the certain big farmers, but there's a lot of small farmers who are well aware that they're not being looked after. Evonne, did you want to
just not underestimate the power of the consumer as well. I think you know, a lot of the trends that we're seeing at the moment in terms of, you know, looking for sustainably produced food, they may be marginal trends at the moment, but I see them growing, and things will shift, you know. And as those consumers are given more and more power, it will drive things as well. It'll drive the way food is being produced. So I don't think we need to look at you know, analyzing things with the current paradigm. You know, I think that is going to shift, and I think the balance will shift as well. We'll reach a tipping point, and it'll no longer be feasible or viable for large farmers to continue along the route that they're on at the moment. I believe that's going to happen. When? I don't know, but I think that we're moving in that direction. I'd like to speed it up.
So I see Elaine, you have your hand up there for a while. You've been very patient. We can bring you in there whenever you want.
Hi, how are you all? I took down a couple of random points, and I used to work with Gerry Group. I was over foods in UK and Ireland, you know, so I've seen a lot of different things, and I'm from Abbeyfield Doyle, so we had co-ops back then, you know. But an interesting point, the mushroom producers in Ireland, they have probably one of the strongest co-ops in the country. Their turnover is approximately 16 million. I think there's about 6 producers involved in that group. 16 million, sorry. And they get their funding through Europe. And the funding comes via the Department of Agriculture. They act as a kind of an agent, if you like. And they submit books back or accounts back to them yearly. But I mean, I think that probably might be a very interesting first approach, you know. They were looking to, the other thing I just wanted to kind of call out, you know, I suppose the amount of strengthening rural Ireland, derelict properties, trying to bring people back into small towns and things like that, and getting small co-ops going. The other thing I'd be very interested in seeing is orchards in every towns, you know, going back to that old thing. My gran and grandmother were pretty much self-sufficient. They had an acre orchard, they produced everything, you know, and it'd be great to see that that's a kind of what I'd call a low-hanging fruit thing that could be organized fairly quickly. I think the key to this is organization, you know. How do you kind of split it by province? Do you start like that and maybe have smaller groups between that? The other thing I think that's important, kind of consider a specialization of crops. For example, if you look at, and in fairness to that mushroom group, they'd be very open, I'd say, to talking. I know one or two of them fairly well, you know, and because I was interested in the co-op thing for quite a while. It's a long story, but another day's kind of conversation. And I think the last thing really is climate crops. Okay, so crops that are resilient to obviously climate change. We can grow pretty much anything here, you know, so it's just brilliant, by the way, to hear everyone talk and to have this so grounded and not kind of highfalutin and very real, you know. So yeah, congratulations to everyone that got it together.
Thanks, Elaine. Sarah, I go to you now. Yeah. Oh, unmute yourself there, Sarah, please. Sorry.
Hi, sorry, I'm a member of the same food co-op as Patrick. Hi, Patrick. And I've just been working in agriculture since late last year, but I pick up the odd statistic that sticks in my head. And Colin was saying, you know, if we're going to feed the cities, where do we get the land? And a stat that stuck in my head, and I've double checked it before, it's either 90% of the beef produced in Ireland or 90% of the beef and dairy produced in Ireland is exported. And I'm vegetarian, but I one day might like to be an organic dairy farmer. So I'm not anti-dairy. I'm not anti-beef. I think there's a time and a place for it, maybe on a Sunday dinner table or a celebration, but not, you know, 3 times a day. And if there's 90% of the most, you know, carbon heavy farming going on to produce dairy and beef to go out of the country, you know, there's a bit of a short-sighted use of our resources, you know. So if you're wondering where you might, you know, if we could just hypnotize everybody into doing what we want to do, it would be try and get the big beef and dairy, conventional beef and dairy farmers to reconsider what they're doing, even a percentage of what they're doing, you know. So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to go to Bobby next, and then Colin.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, so I just have a question. Maybe I guess this would be directed at Evonne. I'm not sure. It's kind of an open question, but to people that are watching this maybe and they do want to, you know, start a cooperative in their local town, or just say they want to start, you know, like a community garden, like where do they start? What supports do these people have? Because like I was thinking, you know, it would be great if there was, you know, some sort of system in place or some sort of institution that could help link farmers to the people in their local town, because I personally feel there's a great disconnect in that. So like, you know, as you're saying, oh, find some unused land from a farmer or something that you can start a community farm and stuff. But sure, I would have no idea where to start if I wanted to do something like that. Or so do you think that that's something that hasn't started yet, or people should wait, or is there a way for people to get started now to, you know, kick this off from a grassroots level?
Yeah, don't wait, do it. Yeah, I think it's a big problem because we're all a bit paralyzed, aren't we? What do we do next? How do we do it? We kind of want instruction manuals, and I think we've forgotten a little bit of how to just get up and do stuff. I think there is a lack certainly of formal supports and guides for those type of initiatives, but there are lots of examples out there, not enough, but there are examples of where people have done it and they're doing it well. And I think that's your school. That's where you need to go find those people. There are networks in a lot of cases, Facebook and all of that is trying to, you know, they do try to pull people together in those areas. Community Gardens Ireland is one organization, the CSA network as well, if you want to go further and look at CSAs. But look, it's about reaching out to people. I think, you know, there are supports from your local, you know, your leader partnership sometimes if you need, but often I find the issue it's not so much funding, it's confidence, you know, that empowerment, sense of, you know, we can actually get out and do these things. Sometimes you have to do it and ask forgiveness afterwards, that kind of bravery, you know, and I think get that from the people who are already doing it, and they've done it, and there's loads of different ways to skin a cat. Like there's many different ways of getting going, and the challenges will be different in different places. I know in an urban centre we'd have huge challenges in terms of just getting access to space. But it'll be different challenges in different places. But reach out to people. People are dying to tell their story, and they're dying to tell you how to do it and give you all the support and information that you might need. So I would say go for it. Whatever it is you want to do it. The worst thing we can do is wait and do nothing. I think anything we can do at all is really positive.
I think that's a good point, Evonne, too, because there's no point waiting for someone else to do it. A lot of these things mightn't feel comfortable when you start first, but you get the ball rolling and start to move.
Can I just have a point on Colum's point about how to get big farmers involved in this? I think this kind of links to what I was saying, that I think it's really important to start now and get the infrastructure in place and everything set up so that, as it was mentioned before, when there's a crisis and big farmers are forced to get involved, there'll always be the system in place to help them join into that. So I don't think they're really the biggest concern right now.
Okay, and I'll just go back to Column.
Yes, well, trying to respond to the lady who spoke about the 500,000 in Dublin. Yeah, I agree. I mean, beef eating and beef production is part of the problem. And I'd also mention seeing a discussion from a transition town organization in England a few years ago, I think it was Wiltshire. And they mentioned that on an 80 acres of Wiltshire, which I take to be mixed ground, they had something like 5% of very good ground and 50% of middling and the rest of not very much. And from their 5% of good ground, they got 80% of their profit and revenue from horticulture. So there has to be a lesson there somewhere, that the model in Ireland, which has been a convenient model for a variety of historical reasons, maybe isn't a long-term runner. I do agree completely with what Gerry Loftus said about, and I think Irish farmers, in fact, all farmers, should be looking to produce less production of higher quality and at a much higher price. So, we need to get the mass of our calories in different methods, not from meat, but in different kind of farming, and it's just going to be it will need to be a different world for us as a species to survive. And when I say need to be, I mean within 30 years.
Yeah. Thank you.
Colm, could I go back in there for a minute, please?
You can, Gerry, absolutely.
Yeah, just something Sarah said there, I think it was Sarah, about the amount of beef and stuff we're producing, and that is correct. We export 90% roughly of what we produce, I think maybe possibly 92%. Now, the other thing about this is that we're a net importer of food since I think it's the year 2000. So our bill to import stuff is more than the 13 or 14 billion we get for exporting. Like, it makes no sense, absolutely no sense what is going on. And there needs to be a massive campaign, and Extinction Rebellion and the Rural Land Organization is going to start a campaign on that to try and do something about industrialized farming, because it's crippling every other part of this country. Now, as well as that, at this moment in time, that is unsustainable. We had about 1.1 million suckling cows, suckler cows, a cow that raises a calf is a suckler cow, the calf sucks the mother and raises the calf, right? Or anyone that might not know that. Now, I reckon that's down to about 500, 600,000. But they're not giving us the correct figures, or they won't. But the dairy numbers have increased to about 1.6 billion. And at the moment, we have 7 billion cattle in the country blowing methane up into the atmosphere. And we have this huge battle going on with IFA and ICMSA and different organizations who couldn't give a damn about the climate or about environment or about anything else. And as every other day, coming up with some random excuse or some answer to some complaint that has been made. Now, I have nothing against the dairy farmer that's doing this incorrectly, nothing whatsoever. But I have an awful lot of problems with 1.6 million dairy cows in the country and what it's doing, and how our young farmers are to their eyes in debt, being on the advice of chocolates and politicians. You need 200 cows, you need a milking parlour, you need a slatted unit, and you need this and that. So you need to borrow 500, 600, 700,000. And that's what a lot of them has done now. And a lot of these people are not sleeping at night. And a lot of the fathers and mothers aren't sleeping at night because they have signed off on the loans for them. And what is going on in this country is unsustainable as regards our climate emissions. So there's no way, a chance in hell that we have any chance of reaching our hitting our 2030 targets unless there's a massive cull of cattle, and it needs to start with the dairy sector. It's as simple as that in my view. And we need less cattle all around. It's not, it's as simple as that. Extend the farming practices. That's the way it should be. You don't, as someone said there, you don't need to be eating meat every day of the week. You want a bit of meat on a Sunday, well, that's grand, or a Saturday. But that's what we have to be gearing ourselves to, or towards. The other thing about this is, as well as there's a lot of discussion about land and about cities and towns. I think the whole lot of this, that there was never a better opportunity from a number of angles. First of all, we have the Green Deal, we have the farm to fork strategy, but we also have never had more talk about pollution from different forms of chemicals, from nitrogen to antibiotics to this, to that, to the other. And there's a huge message to be got out there if people are willing to do it. A message that ordinary people, I think, would buy pretty easily enough. The other thing about the land thing is that in the changes in CAP, and we don't know exactly how this is going to pan out yet, but there's going to be a huge emphasis on armchair farmers. Farmers who have land, who are not farming it, who had entitlements on it, and all they do is lease out the entitlements every year. Now, when I think a lot of land is going to come available because of that, because that is not going to, I don't think that is going to continue. And that was an act by the IFA as well that brought in this long-term reason of you know, that you could draw down your single payment, as was called at the time. It's now your basic sustainability, that you could draw down and not have any animals on that land. That opened the gates to the farmers who wanted to expand and rent that land off them. Like, you know, so now as the pot of money in the cap, look, we're not here to talk about cap, but I'm just saying that because of a number of reasons like that, that more land will become available. And I just think that there was never a better time to approach this with all the tools that we have as regards chemicals and pollution and climate and whatever, you know.
Good man, Gerry. I think I'm going to finish it on that note. There's a lot in what you're saying, Gerry, and you're definitely at the cold face of all this, and you're not shying from the reality of it, and that's important. So I want to first thank all the panelists and for that great talk from Patrick. It's been so insightful, and it's really brought together a lot of great minds. But I really want to thank the participants as well, and everybody who contributed. There's so much great thinkers out there within the country doing different things and trying different things, and it is great to try and get them linked up at every opportunity. And as many of our speakers said there, I think the most important things are to focus on the success stories that are going on here within cooperatives in Ireland, and pump up those success stories, and let's let everyone know about them, so that if anyone's in doubt about their farming practices, that they can look to a cooperative model, and they can look to what another farmer is doing cooperatively with the other farmers, and maybe they can get involved in that. So I will leave the chat on if people want to, because I know there was some links put in there. We'll leave the chat on, but we can sign off the meeting and in recording. Thanks again to everyone for being involved, and we'll see you all in the future.
Thank you, Colin.